I am DeMaurice Moses, and I'm a retired pediatrician. I've been retired over 22 years. And
When were you born and where?
I was born in Washington, D.C., and I was listed as colored. And a joke was made by my doctor because he simply inserted the words ED on the blank that followed the word color. That meant colored. And he was making a statement. That was 88 years ago.
At Friedman's or where?
This was at Friedman's. My mother was very light-skinned. My father was brown-skinned, so I'm colored. And what that meant in 1933 Washington was that I'd be segregated for the rest of my life. And there were hurdles that had to be overcome to get to be a doctor. My father was a colonel in the United States Army by the time of the start of World War II. And I was brought up with a military background. As soon as I could understand anything about life, I was in the Army. And he stayed in the Army for 36 years. Now, I practiced not in Washington, D.C., but in a place called Puyallup, Washington State. And there I was the first African-American doctor. I was not simply a practitioner of pediatrics, but I actually practiced public medicine in addition. I received many awards. But the best one I got was to be designated as an outstanding young man of the state of Washington in 1968. And that was from establishing a children's clinic for poverty-stricken children. And it was the first one that was actually started and continued by an individual doctor in practice. And I sacrificed my days off to run that clinic. I won't go into all the other details that involve that particular award, but I was very involved in the care and making equity situation for children, no matter what their financial or economic value was.
Should we let's
Yeah.
ask Dr. Jarvis to introduce herself, and then I'll come back. Maybe just introduce yourself, where you were born, a little bit of your background, and then we'll go back and talk about
Sure.
who's.
I'm Charlene Drew Jarvis. I'm a native Washingtonian. I was born in Friedman's Hospital, as was Dr. Moses. My father was the chief of surgery there at Friedman's Hospital, and he was not only a clinician but a researcher who discovered a method for preserving blood and plasma, which was critically important during World War II. Plasma can be dried and reconstituted, and so the World War II use of plasma was exceptional in terms of saving lives. I went to the public schools of the District of Columbia, and I went to Oberlin College, to Howard University for a master's degree, and to the University of Maryland for a PhD degree in neuroscience. I followed my father's research path at the National Institute of Mental Health, and the University of Maryland mentor that I had did his research here at the Walter B. Dowery Institute of Research, which is where I spent a good bit of my time here as a graduate student.
So we'll come back to you. Dr. Moses, you had mentioned that you were treated here as a child
Yes.
for a stutter. So.
Yes, thank you for asking me about that. It goes back now about 80 years. This is the first time that I've been back since that time. I've driven by here many, many times, but I never entered through the gate again until today. The experience I had was between the ages of 9, 10, and early 11, when I came to live with my grandmother while my father was away in the Far East during the war. I came because of my stammering. And the first experience I had on day one was simply a wide awakening to the rest of the world. First of all, there were very, very fine white people who were here. Remember, I was in middle childhood, and I wouldn't see white people at all where I lived on 10th Street, and I didn't see a single white person at school. So to come here and be treated, because I knew I couldn't be treated by anyone who was white who lived elsewhere. So everyone was friendly. It was totally different than the experience I had in DC. And it wasn't lost on me that this place was very different. And I remember the women members of the service who were treating me, and they actually convinced me that I could stammer and that I would be able to get over this handicap. And they were so kind to me that I actually did a lot better. When I went to the speech teacher at school, it was an impossible situation. But not only the women who were there took care, and they all told me the same thing, that I would get better as long as I let it get better.
Why was the situation impossible at your school?
Because they thought they were teaching a class. I suppose that's what it was, but I made no progress at all. And what they told me, it was exactly what happened. It didn't matter what situation I was in, whether I was on maneuvers with the Army eventually, which I joined in 1961 from the Berry Plan. I'll come to that later. it was still the same. Everything they said was absolutely correct. You couldn't get better except if you accepted the fact that you couldn't speak in a fluent manner and that your own body would take care of it. And I met people later on in schooling who also stammered, and they were, one of them was a research scientist, and he told me the same thing. And so it was mastery of a handicap more than anything else, and it came from inside of you.
So did you get all your medical care here at Walter Reed, or just?
Yes, I did. I came a few other times for things, and it was, the treatment was the same. It was, I wasn't segregated at all.
Where did you live on 10th Street? What neighborhood, or what address?
I lived in the Shore area, 3 blocks from Shore High School, a junior high school.
And what was the elementary school you were at when you?
I was at Grimke, Archibald Grimke School.
On Vermont Avenue.
On Vermont Avenue. And I had lots of interesting experiences there. So that entails the early days of my interest in Walter Reed, in Walter Reed. I could go on and explain what actually happened from that experience. While I was here, I read in the paper, the Star, it was called the Washington Star, I think. It was a huge article about a man who was an officer at Walter Reed. He was a doctor, and they referred to him as an pediatrician. He was a very handsome man, young, probably no more than 30, and they featured him because he was actually one of the first adolescent medicine doctors. And this was important to the Army because many young men in the Army are barely 18 years old, and they're still adolescents. And they are then told that they're complete men and have to undergo extreme stress and hold up under it, and also be responsible for incredible judgments, which they're completely unprepared for. So he said there's a part of medicine that we're not paying attention to. We think that they grow up overnight. You don't. You grow up over a series of bumps and hurdles, and then you're grown. You might not be actually a full adult till you're 25. So his influence on the Army was started at a young age, and his name was eventually Colonel B. Houston.
Houston?
B. Houston. It's spelled with a B. I met him later on in the flesh, and he was the one that appointed me to my Army assignment. I went to Yale. I graduated ROTC. I wasn't a particularly good Army prospect, even though my father was in the Army. I was scared to death when I went to summer camp, when I was training to call in artillery fire, and for some strange reason I didn't stammer. I was perfectly capable of making a mistake, calling in the wrong coordinates, and blowing up my own men. But that never happened. I hit the target, and that was training me to be a forward observer. They realized that I was admitted to medical school at a very early time, and I went to Case Western Reserve. And the Army held me for all my time in medical school and 2 years of training.
So did you enter the Army, then went to medical school, and
That's right.
okay, and then they
I went
and
to
then you
Case
served
Western
for the Army.
Reserve. And the man who assigned me to Wurzburg Army Hospital in Germany, to the NATO Army, that was in 1961. He was the head of what's called the berry program, berry, just like a berry. And his name was none other than Colonel B. Hewson. So that was like 20 years since I saw him.
Can you spell B. Hewson? I'm never going to figure that one out, I don't think.
I'm not sure whether it's B-E-U-H-U-S-E-N or whether it's B-E-H-U-S-E-N.
Okay, well, that's at least a
Yeah, that
hint
can
for
be.
finding it online or
Yeah.
someplace.
And he was at Walter Reed during the war years. That's World War II. And here we come to the Cold War. I saw Colonel B. Hewson several times during that tour in Germany. I spent 3 years there. He eventually was severely injured in an automobile accident, and he died shortly thereafter. I had left by that time. And the Berry program assigned the doctors to the various Army installations. In this case, it was an Army hospital in Wurzburg, Germany, which was in the northern part of Bavaria. The experience was incredible. The responsibility that I had was well beyond the training level that I had achieved. But the Army had a way of putting you in situations where you were in over your head, but somehow or another you made it through. The Army was like a paradise because you were looked upon as equal to everyone else, except you had to perform. And they were not hard on you in any way. They were very supportive. And I did very well. And went on back to residency, completed my service at the hospital, and decided to go to the Northwest to practice.
So going back to your time in Germany, you had mentioned that you sent children to Walter Reed,
Yes.
evacuated children to Walter Reed if they were, difficult cases or something.
Yeah, well, that was the other issue. a young doctor who was assigned to one of these hospitals had the complete responsibility for very, very seriously involved children. And it was the entire family you had to think about. So you had to make the decision, at least the initial decision, to actually put into place the evacuation of the family to the military hospital, usually one of two, either Madigan in the West Coast, or in the East Coast, it was Walter Reed. There were two children who had to have open heart surgery. There was another one who had a brain tumor. Another one I remember had a genetic disease. And there were several others.
Once they came here, did you ever have
Yes,
see them again?
I did see, actually practice in Puyallup, Washington, and one of my patients that I sent for heart surgery actually had settled there.
That's
And,
a coincidence.
and so I got to know them pretty well. And in that situation, the soldier's career is in jeopardy. Their hopes and dreams, all that's in jeopardy.
I mean, the parent of the.
Yeah, the parents. And so that all has to be taken into account. The preparation for that move is monstrous. There's a huge amount of paperwork that has to be done. You have to describe everything about the child, but you've got other duties to do at the same time. You can't pass that off to anyone else. And what was so great about it was that Colonel Behusen was picking the men who were going to be able to do that. And it could be a surgeon who would do it, but in most cases it ended up an internal medicine doctor or pediatrician. The pediatrician was the one who took care of families in that situation, so it involved multiple people that are moving. The military spared no effort to actually physically take care of the people. So it was once the families understood that their country was fully behind them, that gave them some relief.
Do you know that all those cases were had successful outcomes?
Some didn't.
Did not?
One I know didn't, and that was the one with the genetic disease. And you're not trained enough to fully understand these things, like a genetic disease. This child had what was called Hurler's syndrome. It's a disaster, but it's not conducive with the soldier, this case a sergeant, commanding enlisted men, and then running a family at the same time. It's impossible. So they have to be reassigned. And the military just simply has to take care of the family. They can barely think to actually take care of themselves. And the United States did that. So Behusen was a very important figure because this was happening all over the military installations that the United States had during the Cold War.
Was he the person who called this place Walter Wonderful?
Oh, everybody called it Walter Wonderful.
Really?
Yeah.
Everybody, you mean in Germany
fact,
or everybody everywhere?
all the Army doctors did. And the attitude about it was that it was different from any other place that you would send somebody to.
Because the staff were so caring, or because
Yeah, they were caring, very caring, and I never heard anything but good about it. Now, the other man that I came in contact with was a man by the name of Colonel Schurz. That's just like it sounds. He was acquainted with Walter Reed as the pediatric chief. And I know that he was here during the 1970s. And he was the one who discovered the safety compartment to put pills in. It was an invention that involved, once the cap of the medicine container was put on, you couldn't get it off unless you pressed down hard and turned it in a certain way. An adult could figure it out, but a child could not. And I think everyone was grateful for that, because any child could open anything before that with ease. And so poisoning in children was interrupted by having that kind of an invention.
Safety cap.
It's called a safety cap.
Did he invent it while he was here?
While he was here. You never know when that idea comes to mind, because I know in 1960 we didn't have we didn't have it, and then we suddenly did. So he became, on retirement, the chief medical officer of Mary Bridge Children's Hospital in Tacoma.
Washington.
Tacoma, Washington. And he built that hospital into being able to care for children almost to the equivalency of the Children's Hospital of Seattle, which is one of the top places for care of children in the country and the world. So he was a real force. And when you have that kind of person who is accessible in your hospital system in a place you would think wouldn't have any high-level individual like that, who cut his teeth on high-level medical care at Walter Reed, you're lucky. He was another example of the kinds of people that Walter Reed was turning out. And so there's something rather magical about it.
About the place.
About the place, yes.
Should we go to you, Dr. Jarvis,
Sure.
and then we'll come back.
Sure. I grew up on the campus at Howard University. My father was associated with the hospital. And it was a rather idyllic experience for us. There were 4 children in my family. Bibi, who was named by the nurses when she was born for blood bank. My sister Sylvia, who was named Rear Sylvia by my father, mother of Romulus and Remus, and Charles Drew Jr. We participated in so many of the things at Howard University as kids. We took fencing, we took piano, we swam in the pool, I took the violin lessons, and we enjoyed the being on the campus with the fraternities and the sororities and the children of people who were professionals at the university. And we went to Mott Elementary School, which is where Dr. Moses' mother taught. It was also a place where the aunt of my former husband taught. And that was a school that was dense with highly trained teachers who themselves had gone to Northeastern schools but couldn't find a place in the larger school system. And in the segregated system of Washington, we had the advantage of those teachers. Thus, you had terrific graduates from our high schools. Dunbar High School was one that sent many talented students to Northeastern colleges. There were 4 that went from Dunbar High School to Amherst. That was my dad and Mercer Cook and Bill Hasty, who became very important in the War Department, and Monty Cobb, who became the head of the Department of Anatomy at Howard. So we were raised by my dad's view that excellence of performance would overcome any artificial barriers created by men. And so we grew up with the notion that we should be excellent and that we could compete and that there was no impediment, not race, not class, not gender. And we grew up with this notion of achievement. But this notion of achievement was very much a part of the whole segregated school system in Washington, D.C. So we just grew up understanding that there was an expectation and that we were to achieve, and so many of us did in fact achieve. I went on to Oberlin College and then to Howard University. Again, an institution where there were high achievers because they were coming from families who expected it, and on to University of Maryland. I was among the first African American students in my department. I was a surprise to many people, as was the case with many African Americans of achievement, because there was no exposure of the white community. You've heard Dr. Moses say about his first exposure to the white community. Well, for the white community, there were first exposures of people of color as well. And to compete was important to us.
You may have been one of the few women too, were you?
One of the first women
In your field?
Yes, I think that's true, that I was one of the first women in basic research at the National Institute of Mental Health. And in fact, in all of the institutes of NIH. And I tried very hard to work with the minority office to attract other people of color into research at NIH. It was exciting research. I did a study of the brain first, before I got my degree, I worked under Bill Hodos, Dr. Bill Hodos, at the University of Maryland, and his research was on the visual system of pigeons, and that research was done here at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. So I actually did my research here at Walter Reed under Dr. Hodos, and then went on to the National Institute of Mental Health, where I did that research, and then feeling very strongly that it was necessary to be concerned about the city after Martin Luther King's death, and that there was no rebuilding going on during that time, I made a decision to leave science and to go into public office and to run for public office. I would say that while I was at Walter Reed doing my research, it was 1968, and the riots occurred in 1968, and I can remember being in my laboratory at the time, and the trauma and the upset that occurred in 1968. I remember going to the bank without realizing that there were riots going on, and the bank was right in the middle of the 14th Street corridor. And we lived at 1234 Girard Street, Northwest. From the third floor, I could see the belching of the flames at the time of those riots. And so my calling went to the issue of how to rebuild the city, and I became the chair of the Economic Development Committee of the Council of the District of Columbia. I was appointed by the then chairman of the City Council, who was Arrington Dixon.
What year did you arrive on the council?
Yes, I was elected in 1979 in a field of about 15 people. I had never run for public office, but nor had any of us, many of us run for public office in Washington, because we only got the right to elect members of the council in 1974. We only got the right to elect the President of the United States in 1964. So there were not many people who were accustomed to running for public office at the time. And still we are working very hard to make sure that we have a senator and elected members of the House who have a vote not only in committee but in the full House. So we're still at that. One of the things that happened here at Walter Reed while I was a member of the council is that I was invited to join an advisory committee which wanted to relocate the medical museum that existed here at Walter Reed. That medical museum had been moved from Washington in the Monument area, and there was an interest in moving it back. Dr. Lewis Sullivan was named the chair of that advisory committee by Chick Cooper, who was the Surgeon General of the United States, and it was his interest in moving the medical museum. So we met here at Walter Reed many times to discuss the possibility of moving on to one of the parcels of land of the government in the Monument District. That proved to be a difficult challenge because there were some people who believed that the medical museum's intention was to discuss birth, abortion, advocates for abortion, and that it was going to be just a political medical museum. And finally, after any number of years, Dr. Sullivan said that he believed that the effort to get the medical museum here was not going to be achieved, and he took the whole effort to Atlanta in order to establish the museum.
He'd come from Morehouse, right?
He had come
the
from
dean of the medical school of Morehouse.
He was the dean of the medical school at Morehouse, but he was also the director of Health and Human Services.
Right,
Yes,
yeah.
but so the hat that he wore here was after he had finished both of those parts of his journey. The medical museum here was interesting. It had many very strange and peculiar kinds of displays, but it was small, and the effort was to move it. So I actually worked on that effort on the advisory committee as a member of the Council of the District of Columbia. Walter Reed was certainly a very important part of this community. I was elected from the Ward 4 community. So Walter Reed was a part of my my constituency. It was cloistered. Walter Reed was somewhat cloistered. We felt it to be an important part of the delivery of the healthcare system. It wasn't a part of the healthcare system of Washington, D.C. It serviced military officers, and there were many military personnel, and there were many people in the community who worked at Walter Reed, and they were people who were members of the community. So those were people who were my constituents as well. And there were events here held at Walter Reed that were for the community. I remember having one of my campaign victory parties here at Walter Reed. But it was not part of the constituency with whom we met on a regular basis here.
Which would have been the Army, so.
Yes,
Yeah.
it would have been the Army. So it was run as a federal institution, and the interest in Walter Reed would have come from the federal government and from our local, Eleanor Holmes Norton, elected as our member of Congress. But it was an important institution.
Did you have any idea how many employees of Walter Reed or people, with a stake in Walter Reed were your constituents?
I don't have the number, but there were many who lived in the neighborhood, in Shepherd Park, in Manor Park. But when I was on the council, we still were a somewhat segregated city, and so there wasn't as much integration in the community, but there was more than many other parts of the city, because Shepherd Park was a community that valued integration, and its whole raison d'etre under the leadership at that time was to make sure that we were a community that welcomed all, and they worked hard at it. So I'm betting you that there were members of the Walter Reed community who were here in our community and lived in our community. The crack epidemic, unfortunately, was a part of the history at the time that I was in elected office. And we had communities that walked on Georgia Avenue with orange hats in order to take over corners that had been taken over by people who were in the drug trade. It was a part of our history that was unfortunate. There was violence, there was neighborhood concern, there were many meetings of the community, and Walter Reed personnel participated in some of those meetings because, in fact, there was an Upper Georgia Avenue clatch, if you will, of people who were in the drug industry. One of the things that I did when I was in the council was to try to create more business opportunity along the Georgia Avenue corridor to bring people and money and lights and activity on the avenue. However, we were at a time when people were leaving Washington and businesses were leaving Washington, and we were losing population, and we were facing vacancies in housing. It took a long time to rebuild the community, the neighborhoods during that period, and this is now 2021. It really didn't begin really until the late part of the 90s and the early 2000s. And there is, of course, a revival of our neighborhoods because there are many new people coming into the neighborhood. The most significant thing that happened very recently is that the federal government decided to give to the District of Columbia this entire facility once the hospital itself moved into Bethesda. So the development you see here at Walter Reed came as a result of the federal government's transfer of this property to the District of Columbia and to this Ward 4 community. And it's making a difference in this community. There are many apartments, there are condominiums, there are seniors who are coming out of their homes in Shepherd Park and coming into the community,
Into the housing here.
into the housing here at Walter Reed.
Plus there'll be a grocery store and.
Yes, there'll be a grocery store and lots of business opportunities now that will grow along the avenue because there are more people, a greater density. And of course, this was the thing that I sought to do at a time when it was very tough to do that.
Just apropos of that, there must have been Walter Reed employees who took maybe public transportation or whatever, who had to, deal with crime just getting to work, who weren't your constituents exactly because they didn't live in this ward, but would have been concerned about the same issues.
Well,
How would you have dealt with them, or was there a way, or did they they're just part of the group?
Well, the Walter Reed community was part of the community. One of the things that we did during the epidemic was to call on Eric Holder, who was then the head of the Department of Justice, head of FBI, not yet, and he brought a federal presence to the community and to the Walter Reed community as well, because he could then bring a federal presence to the community, and that was a significant help to us, because that meant that the local police and the FBI could work together in addressing the problems, and particularly on this corridor and lower on the Georgia Avenue corridor, where we were having a great deal of trouble as well. In fact, it seems to me that I remember that we had a meeting here at Walter Reed with Eric Holder. If memory serves me, I believe that happened. So there was a federal presence, excuse me. There was a federal presence that was very, very helpful to us. I didn't stay in public office, but I was in public office for 21 years, and there were some significant accomplishments that laid the foundation for the recovery, for the economic recovery. That could be revenue generators, the convention center, the what was the Verizon Center, business improvement districts, the tax increment financing, all sorts of incentives for business development, for small business development, and for larger downtown development. So that was kind of foundational. One of the important things that I did as well was to, as the chair of the committee that had oversight of banking, and because the District of Columbia was in the oversight of the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, a federal office, we had a chance to determine whether mergers would occur in the District of Columbia of banks coming from outside of the district, and to make a recommendation to the Comptroller of the Currency about whether the city supported those mergers. As a result of that, I had a chance to require of merger banks reinvestment in our communities, and to put more women and minorities on the boards of banks. And as a result of that, there was more lending in businesses along commercial corridors like Georgia Avenue and in other parts of the city, because essentially we had been given by the federal government the status of state in order to determine mergers. That was really a very important part of why we were able to recover, do some economic recovery, because we were able to get some dollars into the city as a result of these agreements with banks.
And this is all this, that and the, forget what word you used, but anyway, what made redevelopment possible later, that was all under your tenure?
That was all under the committee. And the lesson that I learned as the chair of the Economic Development Committee is that the committee had leverage. We had leverage with banks and other lending institutions. We had leverage with developers, and in that case, we would insist that there be community centers as a part of what they did, or senior centers, or training of high school students. For example, we did the NPR building, and we said what we want from you is the training of high school students. So it was the leverage of the committee that allowed me and other members to say to businesses, we're pleased to help you, but when we help you, here's what we want. We want more contracts for local businesses, minority businesses, women-owned businesses. We want more jobs in your businesses, and we want more contracts into the community. So that's how I viewed my job as the chair of the Economic Development Committee. And a lot of that foundational work was really important in what later happened, and it took time. It took time to rebuild the 14th Street corridor, where I had seen the fires belching from the businesses. It was not until 30 years later that the redevelopment of 14th Street began to occur. So the devastation of by the riot was large and complex to overcome, but I had great assurance that I was in the place that I needed to be in order to help, and that I had really stepped out of science in a way that was going to be helpful in the short term. Science is a very hard taskmaster, and your reward comes at a very long period of time, and it has to be augmented by others in research. But I was very fortunate to have learned many of the techniques of neurophysiology and biochemistry in order to do the work which I did. And I'm delighted to see that the Children's Hospital is going to be here at Walter Reed, not only because my husband is a former pediatrician and he's excited about it, but I'm excited about the opportunity to actually see the research which is done here with children, and particularly in the neurosciences. That's the exciting part. But what I discovered when I was in the council was that women and minorities and small business owners very often knew their craft, but they didn't really understand business processes of taxes and of HR and of marketing, et cetera. And so I took a step away from the council and went to Southeastern University, a university founded in 1879 by the YMCA, because the YMCA wanted to teach people coming from urban, rural communities. They wanted to teach the kinds of skills that would be necessary to succeed in urban communities. So this Southeastern started out as an accounting, school of accounting, and there were 4 in the country. That was where I wanted to be, because it was the small business people, and it was the students that I wanted to have the experience of entrepreneurship. Because self-sufficiency in the African American community and in minority communities, it's extremely important. You have to be able to survive in a world in which it is your own achievement which is going to get you to the outcome. You're often not going to be given the opportunity. You have to have the skills to take the opportunity to expand and build businesses. And that was one of the things that I wanted to do.
So the Southeastern University there were 4, where was it founded? I always thought it was a branch of something.
It was a branch of the YMCA.
I see, and they founded 4 around the country.
They founded 4 around the country. Northeastern is one of those schools that survived and survived very well in competition.
Northeastern or Southeastern?
Northeastern. Northeastern was one of the schools founded
Really?
by the YMCA.
In Boston?
And yes.
Wow.
And Southeastern was also one of those. So I found that it was very important, and the students that I drew at this open university were many students who were east of the river, who had not had the experience of entrepreneurship or business development, and that was important. I retired from there in the mid 2000s, but many of the things that I do now are connected to the things that I did before. I'm on the board here at the University of the District of Columbia and Oberlin College as well, which is my alma mater. But I'm also on the board of the Washington Housing Conservancy, whose goal it is to prevent displacement in Washington, D.C., particularly during gentrification, and to encourage investment from people who themselves are concerned about the mission of preventing displacement and who are willing to invest and to take a lower percentage at the end of the 15-year term, that they would come out of it in order to earn their 7%. So that's a very important part of what I now do as well. And I've continued to be connected to education. I served as the co-chair of the Reopen DC committee after the pandemic. Mayor Bowser appointed me to that. So I continue to be very much connected. But the important part of the marriage that Dr. Moses and I have had is that I continue to be a student, if you will, because Dr. Moses' experience in medicine and his history in medicine and his extraordinary memory has given me a great deal of insight into medicine. And I think to a certain extent, I've shared insight in terms of neuroscience because I continue to follow neuroscience. And I continue to learn about the new techniques in neuroscience that are enabling us to really understand a great deal more about the brain. When I studied vision, we talked about the where is it system and the what is it system. Where is something in space? What is it? And now we have a great many more ways than I learned of determining the function, the structure and function of the brain. So these are conversations that we have in the context of our home, and also military history, because Dr. Moses' memory of military history is also quite good, and he learned it from his dad at a very early time. So military history is a lot. The theaters of the Second World War, I have learned a great deal about, and the Walter Reed story is what I learned a great deal about from Dr. Moses as well. You know, that reminds me of a very important part of our discussion, and that has to do with race during the Second World War. My father's work at Columbia University was on banked blood. So he finished his medical degree and he went to Columbia University to begin what was essentially a PhD in surgery. He worked under Dr. John Scudder in his laboratory, and what he did very painstakingly was to discover how to store and preserve both whole red blood and plasma. My dad, Dr. Drew, is sometimes called the father of the blood bank because of the work which he did. That was the work that was being done in 1939 and 1940. And at the time, there was segregation of the blood supply. The Surgeons General of the United States Army and Navy determined that there should be segregation of the blood supply. And at that time, my father himself would not have been able to donate blood. My father said, as a scientist, let me be clear, there is no reason to segregate the blood of African Americans and white Americans. And he was very vigorous in his opposition to the segregation of blood, but there were also many other people. At the War Department, there was Bill Hasty, who was a classmate of my dad's at Amherst College, and who went on to the War Department to really an important role and to take a position against the segregation of blood. The Red Cross followed the direction of the Surgeons General of the Army and the Navy in the segregation of blood. And my father and many others again said there's no scientific reason to segregate the blood. Whole red blood need not be segregated, and certainly plasma need not be segregated. It is powdered, it is reconstituted on the battlefield, it is given to save lives of all soldiers. And finally, there was another decision that the African American blood would be accepted, but still that there would be segregation of the blood. And the American Red Cross followed that and did not change that that procedure until 1950 as well. That was part of the war. That was part of the military. That was part of Walter Reed. That was part of our society and healthcare delivery. And at that time as well, the American Medical Association would not permit African American physicians to have staffing privileges at all white hospitals. When my father was at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital doing his, as a resident, doing his research also, he was told that he could not be physician to the rich white women who came to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital.
But did they even have black patients there?
Probably at Columbia they would have had black patients at the time, but I'm not clear about that,
No.
to tell you the truth.
Actually, they didn't.
They did not.
'Cause my father my father did his undergraduate years for 2 years before he went to law school at Columbia.
Okay.
And there wasn't any, there was no such thing as educating a black student in a medical school
Right.
like that.
Yeah. Well, of course, that was why Dr. Drew had gone to McGill, because the universities in the country, if they admitted black students, they admitted one black student per year. Actually, my father, before he was in medical school, was admitted to Harvard, but they told him the next year, and his view was that he wanted to be a doctor and he wanted to proceed.
I mean, he would have to wait a year.
He would have to wait a year in order.
Oh, because they already had their black students for the year.
They already had their black students. And so the issue of blood is one we can see many of the impacts of the segregation of blood, of the suspicion that the black community has of the healthcare system because of the segregation of blood, because of the Tuskegee experiment, because of the segregation of the healthcare system, in which African American patients often had beds that were designated for blacks, in hospitals that had beds that were designated for whites, and also because of the myth of the way in which my dad lost his life. He was driving his residents to the South to an annual meeting. He had had a full day, including surgery and an event in the evening. There were 4 people driving. He was driving early in the morning. He fell asleep at the wheel.
Because they couldn't spend the night
Because
anywhere.
they could not find a place to sleep on the North Carolina highway. If they had been driving, if they had been given a place to sleep and put their heads, my dad may have survived. But he was grievously injured. He was not denied plasma or a blood transfusion. There was an attempt to transfer him to another hospital, but he died before he could be helped. But there was another gentleman along the highway, Avery Malthus, who was a military man who was in an accident, the same highway, and was taken to the to Duke University Hospital, where there were no more black beds, if you will, designated for African Americans, and they sought to transfer him to another hospital where he passed, either along the way or at the hospital. And so a myth arose that Dr. Drew had been denied admission and turned away.
Someone else was, though. Someone else was.
Someone else was denied admission to Duke University Hospital. So there was a myth that arose. My mother had always sought to disabuse people of the notion that Dr. Drew was treated poorly at the hospital. There was even testimony from the nurse who accompanied him in the room, and from the doctor's colonel who treated him. And my mother always sought to disabuse us of the notion that he died because of maltreatment, because she felt it was important to tell the truth, and that my father was devoted to life-saving, and she did not want his memory to be one that he was in fact denied admission to a hospital. I have spent a good bit of my adult years talking to Red Cross chapters across the country, and I've also spent a lot of time talking to marrow centers in order to encourage marrow donation by African Americans and other minorities, because the best possibility of a match is from someone who has similar HLA typing. So I have tried now, even currently, I'm being asked with some frequency to help get African Americans to donate blood, because O-type blood is the most frequently occurring among African Americans, and there is a concern that there won't be sufficient O-type blood. In fact, we just spent some time talking in a Zoom on that matter to encourage African Americans to donate blood. So blood donation, blood history. My dad's history is very much a part of our lives. There are now many people who have discovered that Dr. Drew did some very seminal work in blood preservation and storage, and want to learn more about his contributions and want to understand the history, the segregation of blood supply, and Dr. Drew's involvement in pushing back on the science that would have indicated that there were differences in the blood of African Americans and whites. And in fact, this week, Dr. Moses and I are going to have lunch with a professor from George Washington University, Dr. Guglielmo, or Professor Guglielmo, who wrote a very long piece about the history of blood segregation in the Red Cross. He entitled it a rather unique thesis, Red Cross Double Cross, because he understood the history. I think it's very important for people to give blood. I think it's very important for African Americans to give blood. I think it's very important for my father's life not to mean that we do not participate in giving blood and marrow and other life-saving procedures, because my father's life was about saving.
So does that mean that blood, plasma and blood was segregated here too? I mean, this was a place that everyone says treated everyone equally, but...
Well, that order came from the Surgeon General.
So did it affect the Army, or?
Yes, it definitely did. The
Well, obviously so, because you already said that, so,
Yeah.
yeah. So that means that,
Well, the reason I knew about it was that General Kendrick, he was the commander at Walter Reed during my years in the Army, but he was also commander for at least a year of all the doctors in Europe with NATO. When he was a junior officer, he was ordered by his Surgeon General of the Army to segregate blood. He came personally to Dr. Drew, and along with the Surgeon General of the Navy, and was told this blood will be segregated by both the Army and the Navy.
so, I mean, you weren't in the hospital here, but do you know if were black patients next to white patients? I mean, Walter Reed Hospital didn't follow that rule or that custom, I guess it was, of, having,
Yeah, actually, they didn't have to follow that because this was federal land.
and well, that was also a custom, it wasn't
Yeah.
a law, but I mean, so,
Yeah,
but they would have still followed this blood segregation.
I can't speak to whether it was actually done at this hospital of Walter Reed, because I don't know exactly. But I do know that they wouldn't have had to follow that because it was a policy on Army installations to not segregate. However, it took place anyway in some places. I think it depended, it was up to the commander of the base, because early in the war, my father was an instructor at Fort Monroe in the use of coast artillery and anti-aircraft, because he was highly educated. And we were told by the commanding officer that he would not be segregated, neither would his family, because we lived in that area. And so we weren't. And but once we were off the base, then we were subject to the segregation laws.
So the work which my father did when he was named the head of the Blood for Britain program, there was no blood segregation in Britain.
Was Blood for Britain an American program to assist
It
Great
was.
Britain after?
It was a British program. My father did his work for the British,
Oh, okay.
and the British did not segregate blood.
Wow.
So here he is working in Britain, and there was no blood segregation. He comes back to this country, and here we are in the middle of this debate. My father used a word which I've never let my kids use. He said, blood segregation is stupid. He said, you need the blood. He said, there's no reason for it, and you need the blood. And what is the reason that you are demeaning your own citizens in this country?
Well, big question.
Yeah.
I think we need to wrap up. But have you said everything you, I don't know if we got back to everything you were going to say later.
Well, if I can sum it up,
Okay.
the military needs military medicine to actually help take care of civilians who are in other countries that our military is operating in order to develop relationships with them. And we have trouble separating the role of military medicine from the communities that we operate in. And that's another part of military medicine. The best place to do it is in the relationship between the doctor, in this case a military doctor, and women, and the children that they bore. The Army doctor has to operate in war-torn areas in that manner. That's a natural gift that we have. But if we think that the civilian population is wrapped up in creating casualties on our troops, that interferes with it. And so actually the military has physicians that would be good at doing this, and they want to do it. But it's a matter of integrating it properly. There were some attempts to do this. One of the men that helped me a lot with the children's clinic that I founded on my days off, he was such a man. And unfortunately, while he was getting set to go back to the Middle East to do just what I had said, he drowned in an accident. So it was a terrible thing. And then, of course, our Army personnel were attacked. And so we got into the habit of bombing first and not having any relationship, and then not ever having any relationship.
Bucky, I think it's important to also note that after the war, Dr. Drew was asked to go to military installations in Germany and in France to assess the medical practices, the staffing, the need at those military installations, both in France and Germany. We were just kids. I was an 8-year-old, and I remember the postcards from Germany and France, and I read many of the letters that he sent to my mother, where he talked about being in war-torn Germany and the destruction that occurred after the war, and the need to rebuild the military medical establishments in those war-torn areas. So it just is a compliment to what Bucky has just said about military installations.
Civilian, for the civilian
population. And to connect to the population.
Sort of a diplomat.
Yes.
Almost diplomatic.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So that's what Walter Reed will or should be involved with. It's more, you do more with friendship than you do with harming civilians. But it's in addition to preventing harm, you have to actually work, and the fighting part of the Army has to protect the doctor while that's going on, and the doctor has to be trained in order not to be afraid, because it's dangerous. So it's doctors developing doctors who can actually work under the psychological aspect of danger of being killed. And that's something Walter Reed, the concept of Walter Reed, has to carry out in the future.